mid-19th century, Louisa May Alcott was a struggling, aspiring writer. She'd written a great deal for periodicals, published a few books, and even dabbled in sensationalism. Most of these she wrote under her own name, but some she penned under pseudonyms. Nevertheless, despite her attempts on all of these fronts, nothing ever really caught. Nothing worked to bring her star fully into the realm of mass popularity. This frustrated everyone involved. Alcott often complained of her tensions with the publishing industry, that they didn't appreciate the kind of work that she was penning, and in return, the industry urged her to write things that she didn't want to write, things that they thought were more likely to sell. And so, this combative relationship wore on. But then, in 1868, Alcott gave in. She wrote a story that she thought her publishers would finally be pleased with the intention of proving to them that what they wanted was boring, unlikely to succeed, and embarrassingly sentimental. She wrote this story, sent it in, and by year's end, it was the most popular book in America. That book was Little Women. Little Women would continue to live in the zeitgeist uninterrupted for the next 156 years, spawning countless adaptations, reprints, spin-offs, and a fandom that would transcend both era and generation. As Little Women got older and entered public domain, any limitation to the places and forms that Little Women could go completely dissolved. So, for the last century, Little Women has been anyone's property, free to reprint, adapt, and engage with however you might see fit. And that has certainly happened. A lot. Anlie Williams is a graduate student here at UNCW, and she has been examining these varied and disparate versions of Alcott's most famous novel. She has been looking at how different elements of these renditions affect the original work, and how these versions alter the experience for the reader. She has dedicated her thesis to this project, and her findings speak to both the fine line between ownership and property and the publishing marketplace, culture, and art. From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Anlie, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad to be here.
What inspired you to start looking into the differences between the myriad publications of Little Women?
So I grew up with Little Women, and it's always been one of my favorite books. However, this idea actually evolved from an interest I have in ergodic and experimental literature. I won't go down the rabbit hole of all the different terms there are to describe these kinds of books, because that would take a while. But the short of it is that I'm interested in books that may take more effort to read than just flipping through pages and moving our eyes from left to right. So originally, I was going to write about 2 21st century books for this project, S by J.J. Abrams and Doug Dorst, and then Stephen Hall, he's a British writer, Maxwell's Demon. I talked a lot with Dr. Shelnut, who's now at Vassar College, in the early stages of this project. While she was at UNCW, she taught an English Lit major intro course on Little Women. I took that class, and then she mentioned to me 2 years later, when we were talking about my thesis project, that one of her undergrad students had done a presentation on an edition of Little Women that I would be interested in, which was the Chronicle Books edition by Barbara Heller, published in 2021. Has a lot of really cool interactive ephemera. And I remember I ordered that book after our conversation. I think that was the most excited I've ever been for an Amazon package to come in. And then once I had the book in my hands and I was looking through and kind of pulling all the letters out that she's designed, I was like, this is it. I can't not write about this. And I think that's something I find just with going to the archive and like with my Wentworth trip a few weeks ago related to this project or reading in general. You don't know where things are going to go, but you have to trust yourself that it's going to end up somewhere good. I think that happened here. I will say I did feel a little bit apprehensive about writing about Little Women just because it is so saturated. I mean, there is so much out there already on it. But I think that's the nice thing with Alcott is that her work is so rich and ambiguous at times. I mean, I think there's a lot of that with Little Women, with the ways that people interpret it now, which we're going to get more to later. But it has the room and the depth for that too, which is nice.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of crazy how Little Women has spawned almost its own little like cinematic universe because there's so many different versions of it. There's so many there's Alcott sequels, and then there's all the fan stuff, and then there's an anime version. It's crazy how worldwide the book of Little Women is.
Yeah.
Your thesis specifically examines the form and design of the Chronicle books and the Andrew McMeel editions. What was it about these two editions that stood out to you from the rest? Because there's so much to pick from.
Right. So they're ephemera, they're inserts that they have that they've added to these. The 2021 edition focuses on reproducing letters and correspondence from the novel as they would have looked like if they were actual 19th century documents. The 2022 book that I look at, on the other hand, it includes inserts and extra info on Louisa May Alcott and her life, 19th century American history, a recipe, a family tree. So both books have this quality that I mentioned earlier of kind of being interactive versions of the novel, which is really something we haven't seen yet. So there's these things you can take out and read, unfold. I think with the 2022 book, there's even like something that's really like sealed up. You have to open an envelope and all of this stuff.
Huh, that's really neat.
Yeah, I think when I was a kid, like reading for fun was escapism. Mm-hmm. When I would read, it would like let me feel like I was in another world. And I think something similar is kind of happening with these books. I mean, of course, for now, as a student of literature, that looks different. I'm much more aware of like what's happening for me when I read. I'm more drawn to like reading as fuel for action, I guess. Emerson says it better than I can. He says, books are the best of things well used, abused among the worst. What is the right use? They are for nothing but to inspire. The one thing in the world of value is the active soul. So I think what drew me in was the ways that they physically force the reader to become involved in the reading process. You really have to be aware of where you are when you're handling these, because pieces could fall out and get lost, or you might read things in a different order depending on how you look at these inserts. So it's not only the effect that the work has on us, I think, but with these, it's also the effects that we have on the work that kind of change our experience.
That's cool. Yeah. I really, really feel that notion of reading a book, not just as escapism, but when an author, or in this case, not even the author, but the publisher, is able to make it feel like you're entering another world, and like you're entering Alcott's world by looking at recipes and family letters and all of these things. My favorite series of books of all time is Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And I loved reading those as a kid because basically it was kind of the same thing, where in that series of books, the main character, Arthur Dent, will then at random times not understand anything that is going on in the narrative, and he'll just like go off to the side and he'll open his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it will contextualize everything that's going on. And it's always very funny, and it's always like, it's brilliantly written. But when you're reading it, even though the book is written in third person, whenever Arthur goes off to see what's going on and read in his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's that same experience where then suddenly you're him learning about this universe, and it makes it all feel so real. You're like, wow, this is a whole expanded, even though it's fictional, it feels like this is a real sci-fi universe that I have just peered into. And I love when an author or just a piece of art is able to accomplish that level of world building and like separation from our world and like immersiveness. I think it's just incredible. What are some of the key differences that you've noticed between older versions of the novel and the more contemporary publications? Because like I said, people have been reprinting this book now for over 100 years.
Right, yeah. I think one of my favorite discoveries that I've come across was Jo's handwriting in Heller's Ephemera from the 2021 book, the way that it changes, the way it's displayed. So her writing changes over time as Jo ages in the novel. When she's younger, it's like very kind of messy scribbled print, which, you know, maybe at first that isn't a surprise, but it ends up ultimately looking like Meg's handwriting, which is this really, really beautiful, ornate cursive. And so I have a line of my argument where I go into how I think that shift shows a sacrifice of Jo's authorial agency that she makes in order to satisfy her family, to conquer herself and become a little woman, as Mr. March kind of demands of them in his letter to them.
Mm-hmm. That attention to detail in the republication, that's really interesting. I love that. One of the main features of modern printings of Little Women is the inclusion of paratext, and paratext is basically anything outside of the original text that an author deems important enough to include. And so that can be letters, it can be journal entries, it can be critics' reviews, whatever, just anything that a publisher is like, this is important to have included with it can even be sequels sometimes. I have other writings by the author. How do these inclusions help us better understand Little Women, and how do they influence the way that you interact with the novel?
So with the 2021 edition, we get a sense of each of the characters' personalities from their letters, handwriting, stationery, and style. Personally, I think the correspondence makes the book feel more intimate. We've talked about that a little bit already. As if readers are friends of the March family, which is a nice touch. I mean, especially for fans of the book. And the 2022 edition, on the other hand, it has inserts with information about 19th century American history and Louisa May Alcott. And those are really, I think, most useful for like the first time reader of Little Women.
Mm-hmm. As I've said already, this book has been around since 1868. And yet it is continually republished and remade into different versions. There are a dozen movie and television adaptations. There are comic book versions, which I know you gave a presentation on last semester. There's even a Japanese manga rendition of the tale. Why do you think that this story has continued to be such a persistent presence with global audiences over the centuries?
Yeah, so I think one maybe obvious answer to this is just the novel's lasting, really universal themes of sisterhood and family. Mm-hmm. I mean, those resonate and speak to a really vast audience. And like the situations the March girls encounter, like when Joe burns Meg's hair and they have a fight, or when Laurie falls in love with Joe, the feelings and emotions that scenes like that evoke are reasons lots of lay readers can identify with this story and see themselves in the characters. You know, that's a reason most people like to read. I mean, on that same note, though, I think in another sense that people have begun to commodify or capitalize off of that as well. You know, we have these classics that people love to read, but we keep reissuing them, like as you said, as special editions, as reprints. So in my mind, it's two-sided. Like, yes, we love the story, we love the narrative, but I think we also, and maybe not us, but like publishers and movie producers, that sort of thing, like they like the money that comes along with that. I mean, ultimately with these adaptations and these reprints and things, I mean, someone is making money. So there's that side of it too.
Yeah, I think that once something becomes successful, it marks itself for remake. And then once a remake becomes successful, it just marks itself for, okay, we're going to remake this every couple of years. It's like, you know, A Star is Born gets remade every couple of years. The Great Gatsby gets remade every couple of years. The Little Women gets remade every couple of years. King Kong gets remade every couple of years. It's and people get excited for them. Every single time somebody tries to remake Godzilla, there's hype around it. Even though we probably don't need to remake Godzilla anymore, we could come up with something new. But Little Women falls into that same category where another decade goes by and Gerwig says, I'm going to take on Little Women. And even though the last version of Little Women was perfect, we're all excited about it.
The 1994?
Yeah.
I grew up on that one. It's my favorite.
We are all still excited about the remake. I, too, am a scholar of Little Women. I have written 2 lengthy papers about Alcott's work, and I have not dedicated a thesis to it, so you definitely know more than I do. But I thought that it would be fun to enter a bit of a scholarly debate, because I think that I have a take on Little Women that every time I offer it up, nobody has ever thought of it before, nor do they usually agree. So I thought it would be fun to have this conversation on air. I have a complicated relationship with Little Women. On one hand, I adore it. I really love the story. I love the movies renditions, especially the last 2 that have been made. I think that they're excellent films, and I love reading the book. I adore it as a delightful tale of 4 sisters making their way in a world and experiencing the arduous adventure of growing up. The book warms my heart every time that I read it. But on the other hand, I just can't ignore the fact that Louisa May Alcott wrote the narrative out of spite. Last semester, I wrote a paper which applied Gothic and patriarchal horror theory to the novel, and I attempted to illustrate that Little Women could actually be read as a horror novel, much more in the stylings of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre or Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and I'd like to explain my reasoning. In Little Women, none of the March sisters are allowed to succeed in their own independent endeavors. They ultimately fail to arrive at their castles in the air that they envision for themselves at the beginning of the story. By the book's end, each of the girls has to undergo an episode of soul-crushing humbling before they are allowed their happily ever after. They have to discard their personal ambitions and submit wholly to the patriarchal control. This, I think, is the heart of what Alcott was getting at with her novel. I think that she was so fed up with the patriarchy stomping all over the work that she wanted to publish that she specifically wrote some of the most wholesome, Christian, sentimental stuff that she could just to appease the publishing gatekeepers as sort of like a low-key FU. But because she was such a genius and she hid this feminist horror novel so well between the lines of her narrative, it slipped through and became wildly popular for what I think is the wrong reasons. I think the point of the novel is actually each girl's ultimate failure to achieve their personal dreams. So, as a serious Alcott scholar, what are your thoughts on this theory? Because I love talking to people about it because most people disagree with me, but I really do believe it.
Yeah, so I think that's certainly one way to read Little Women. I find myself leaning towards that line of thinking sometimes as well. But I think there's a few things that give me pause and keep me from fully saying, that this is a horror novel and that there are no happy endings for the March women. So first, Alcott's reason for writing Little Women, which you've touched on, and then second, Jo's ending in the novel. So you said earlier that Alcott wrote Little Women out of spite, and I would agree with that to a certain extent. She certainly didn't think the book would do well, and she told her publishers at Roberts Brothers that she found the book dull. However, she did ultimately write Little Women for the money. And as a 19th century female writer who was trying to support her family, because her father, Bronson Alcott, certainly didn't, she needed to write what would sell. And you get towards that. And I think, Little Women is published in two parts, which is, I think, important to this discussion because as the first book came out, readers were, responding, is she going to marry Laurie? And Alcott says, I'm not marrying Jo to Laurie to please anyone. But I guess I see the outcomes of Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy as sort of reflections of what she knew would sell by that point. Because she did get feedback on the first part of the novel, she was like, okay, I'm going to have to marry Jo to kind of give her this ending. I don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. But she did kind of in a way push back against what the public was expecting. By marrying Jo to Professor Bear, it is in its own way, I think, maybe a push against what people were expecting.
Yeah, she did anything that she could to retain agency.
Right. And then to my point about Jo and her ending, yes, she marries Professor Bear and they open a school at Plumfield. That's how the novel ends. But there are two books that come after Little Women, Little Men, and Jo's Boys. While Alcott never focuses on Jo as a writer in those sequels, we do find out early on in Jo's Boys that Jo publishes a novel, so she doesn't stop writing. I think it's important to note that. And then one last thing that I'll add to is the content of what Jo writes certainly changes. And we see this play out in Little Women, but that's a whole separate conversation.
Mm-hmm. So with that, and I agree with everything that you've said as well, this to me really gives me an even more complicated relationship with the more progressive attempts at modernizing Little Women, like Gerwig's adaptation in 2019. Because I love the movie and I think that she did such a wonderful job with the story, but she makes a number of choices in the dialogue and even the storytelling that makes the story a little bit more feminist, a little bit more progressive. Amy has a monologue she has a very self-empowering monologue. And then Meg even tells Jo when she's getting married, this is what I've wanted. This is what I've wanted all along. And that's not in the book. And then she makes Professor Bear a young, handsome man and doesn't actually end the movie with them getting married and ends the story with Jo getting Little Women published, which is making her an Alcott character even more than...
yeah, and that doesn't even happen in the book.
No, because that doesn't even happen in the book. And it makes for a very nice, empowering movie, but I feel that it misses the point because I think that, I would love to see a version of Little Women done by, Jordan Peele instead. One where at every turn the Little Women just can't get what they want, and at the end they just wind up in soul-crushing patriarchal control. Because I think while nobody would like it as much, I think that it gets more at the point.
Yeah, I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think for me, it's kind of about this tension between the original context and the intentions that Alcott had behind her work, kind of in comparison to contemporary societal values and the expectations that we bring to the table from our moment. Compared to the 19th century, I'd say that looks a little bit different. But any active adaptation has to navigate that. And I think everybody's going to do it differently. And I think for the most part, that's a good thing. I think there's certainly lines of argument about gender, agency, and ambition that appeal to me more than others. particularly when it comes to Little Women. But as far as Gerwig's adaptation in particular, I love it. Anything and everything that she has made so far, I think has been marvelous. I will say I grew up on the 1994 film with Winona Ryder, and that one has a very special place in my heart. So the first first time that I watched Gerwig's adaptation, it took me a little bit to warm up to it because it is so different than the 1994, which just feels fairly close to the text, just in how I picture it in my head when I read it.
Yeah, I love Greta Gerwig so much. Every time she makes a movie, she like moves even closer to the center of my heart. I've loved everything that she's done. Lady Bird was exceptional, and her version of Little Women was incredible, even with my reservations. But then the Barbie movie absolutely blew my mind. I thought it was so popular. And I actually think that it was so popular for some of the wrong reasons. Like the script of that movie, I wish that it had won Best Picture because I think the script of that movie was a genuine masterpiece. The way that Gerwig and her husband, who's her co-writer, were able to weave in like genuine feminist theory into the dialogue and the storyline of like using the line like everything that we need to dismantle the patriarchy is built into the system. I'm just like, I'm watching that with my wife and I'm like, that's feminism 101. Like how is nobody talking about how brilliant this movie is?
Yeah. And I mean, I think my biggest takeaway from Gerwig's adaptation that I really appreciate as like a way of getting forward maybe into an interpretation of Little Women that is more in line with ways that we read it now is really her willingness to break away from a chronological timeline. I think that's one of the biggest things. And to do those flashbacks and like flash forwards. And I think it gives us a whole new feel to like how we see the angles of the March women as they're young and then as they grow up. It's just a really nice reframing of a way of kind of getting towards some of the things we've talked about.
Did anything surprise you while you were researching this topic?
Yes, I was actually surprised that no one has really written on these editions yet, particularly the 2021 book. There had been some conversations about it in listservs that I'm on, but no one has actually published anything. And while both the 2021 and the 2022 editions are actually part of classic series, so there's other books that kind of go along with them that are adapted in similar ways to those, I had really expected for there to be some articles out there about books like these editions that are, I think in some ways more than like special editions of text because they have these added elements. But that's not the case. So this area is underexplored. That's maybe not surprising because these books aren't historical yet per se. But it's also really fun because I kind of get to be one of the first people to like throw my thoughts about them out there. So
yeah, that is fun. Yeah, it's an interesting relationship with like doing your own research and then also needing to find sources. If you're doing, I had a problem with this. I was trying to write a paper on a TikTok trend and there was no scholarship on it at all because it was so recent. And I was like, well, I kind of can't write this paper now because I have no one to back me up.
Right. So then it's kind of like where I had to go to, okay, well, how have we described kind of more materially evocative or experimental text? What terms have we used? And so I've kind of got a framework for that. And then I propose my own terminology and all of that. So it was more like the framing around the conversation rather than here's what other people have already said about this exact thing. That
gets at my next question. How did your research focus change over the course of the project? Because I always find you start out with a research question and then by the end of the project, it's like a completely different final product than you had envisioned at the beginning.
Yeah, I think originally I had wanted to kind of focus on like the reading process of these and just like, what does it mean when we come to a piece of ephemera and we come to this letter and we stop reading the novel, like the actual text, and we're engaging with this other letter. But then I think as the project went on, I was more interested in the actual like material qualities of the ephemera. And I started to think about, okay, like how does this handwriting change from the beginning to the end of the book? What does that mean? What does that show? So I think it shifted to be more of a close read or a close material analysis of the actual ephemera rather than it just being some sort of interruption in our reading experience of the novel.
Your project is focused on the materiality of Alcott's work, and especially these new and frequent republications, and how the hands of others have influenced its perception over time. What is important about looking at books this way and not just through a text-centered lens?
I'll start with this. A professor told me once that authorship is constructed and contextual. And I think that's something that we especially see with books like these because there are so many people involved in kind of the reimagination of these texts. And like While it's of course important to think about Alcott and her intentions with the novel, by focusing on ways that we continue to reinterpret and give Little Women new meanings in a modern context, particularly through its materiality, its circulation, its production, we can better understand how the book moves and works as an object today in our moment, and not just as something that was written, 200 years ago. In my opinion, with classics and things that we really especially consider to be part of the literary canon, there can sometimes be this idea that the text should be interpreted solely as the author wanted it to be. I think that's becoming less prevalent now because we're more aware of it. But at the same time, I think that if we do that, if we get wrapped up in kind of the historical prestige or a sense of exclusivity, that can be really detrimental. But if we look at literature and say, what can we learn from this? How can we understand it in our moment? And urgently and continually ask what and who is missing in what we're reading and what we're teaching, what has been ignored. In doing that, we make the humanities more accessible to a wider public and more inclusive. I would argue this cultivates a more informed and culturally competent view of what literature is and what it does in the world than if we just limit our thinking to some perceived notion of authorial intent and that's all, and that good literature is only present in the traditional literary canon.
Mm-hmm. What major conclusions have you come to at the end of this project?
Yeah, so this has helped me to see some more of the nuances and ambiguity present within Little Women. I thought I knew the book really well before I started this project, but sometimes there's still things that I find that are surprises or that give me a new perspective. That's one of the fun and maybe unexpected things that I've found. For me, doing a thesis as a whole has taught me that my work is constantly evolving. It's never static. It's never fixed. There's always more questions to ask and writing to revise. I'd say that's the biggest conclusion that I've come to. And while that isn't necessarily a research epiphany or a massive revolutionary takeaway about Little Women, I'm glad that I've discovered that throughout this process.
What led you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place?
Yeah, so my lifelong affinity for books and reading. I grew up a bookworm. I read Little Women when my mom read it out loud to me and my sister when we were like 10 years old. So I've known the book for a really long time. A desire for personal and professional growth, a desire to do work that matters to me and that gives back in some way to other people. This is sort of cliche, but I've always wanted to love the work that I'm doing rather than be worried about, making a six-figure salary. I think maybe that's the position of most people in the humanities.
Yeah.
And so far, the more that I study, the more that I write, the more that I work on questions and projects that matter to me, the more that I love what I'm doing. Is it always easy? No, of course not. There's lots of days where I sit and I stare at my computer and I'm like, I can't write, or this isn't good. But so far it's professionally rewarding. And I think more than that too, it's personally rewarding. I think that's the core of it for me. Studying literature, it not only expands my intellectual capacity, but it enriches my experience as a person living in the world. I'm challenged to be both a better version of myself and a better human in society. And I think that's due in large part to my humanities degree.
Yeah. What do you intend to do with your degree or this project in the future?
So I'll be starting my PhD in English at Vanderbilt University once I graduate. So that's very exciting. So my MA is going to be extremely practically useful in furthering my education. It's going to give me an idea of what graduate study is like so that I go in, knowing a little bit more about what to expect and what I want to research. And then as far as this project, one of my goals is to pull this out, hopefully next summer if I have time, and begin revising it for publication.
Oh, very good. Nice. I hope to see it in a journal someday. What gives you hope right now for the future of the humanities?
I'm currently working my way through the MLA's new book on doctoral education in the humanities. It's titled Graduate Education in a Thriving Humanities Ecosystem and focuses on imagining, quote, a sustainable, thriving, and even joyful future for the humanities. So I think for me right now, it's projects like those that give me hope, especially as a soon-to-be doctoral student in English, because the landscape is so dismal. There's a growing sense of awareness, for this need that we need to not only demonstrate our value to people outside the humanities, but also within it as well. We're continuing to imagine new ways of being and doing literature, of ways to reach beyond what we know, even in the face of a difficult higher ed landscape. Take ChatGPT, for example. One question I feel like we were all asking was, what do we do if this AI can give us a close reading of Hamlet? How do do we get around that? But while we can see this technology as a threat because it challenges methods we're familiar with. At the same time, I think it's also a push that we needed to get creative, to break out of old patterns. And I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying that close reading isn't of value. I do it all the time. It's useful. It's one of the main methods that I draw on in my thesis. But I do think there is a lot that we can do beyond it too. And I think that's where the future of the humanities is headed.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Our last question is always the same. What is the best book that you've read recently?
I would not say that it's the best, but it is the one that I've enjoyed the most recently out of this year. But it's Iron Flame by Rebecca Yarros.
Nice.
It was solely for entertainment purposes, but in my free time, I really enjoy reading most anything and everything, to be honest, and fantasy is one of those. I could not put it down. I read it in like 3 days. It ends on a cliffhanger that was very dramatic, which is going to be rough because the next book does not come out until January of 2025. So,
Anlie, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dan.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Daniel Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. Special thanks to Randall Library and the excellent people at the Digital Makerspace for lending us their studio. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.